In this video, we're going to look at an amazing passage of Scripture, and it's actually one of my favorite passages, where Jesus performs two miracles, and we're going to see how they actually intertwine in kind of an interesting way. Here in Mark chapter 5, beginning in verse 22, it says, "And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name, and when he saw him," that is Jesus, "he fell at his feet." This man, Jairus, whose name, interestingly, means enlightened, we're told was one of the rulers of the synagogue. That meant he was a man of importance, and here we see him falling at Jesus' feet. Quite a picture. It says in verse 23, "And begged him earnestly, saying, My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live." So here, this ruler of the synagogue is falling at Jesus' feet and begging him for help. It says, "My little girl," and in Luke's account, Luke chapter 8, verse 42, it says that she was his only daughter and was 12, as it does in this passage in Mark 5 and verse 42, as we'll see in a minute. Verse 24, "So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and thronged him." That word thronged, interesting word. It literally means to be crowded on all sides. And really what it's describing is a really large crowd. Just like you often see in movies that have multiple layers to them or tell, two or three different stories, there's a meanwhile moment. So they sort of set the stage. Here's the first character, whatever, their story, and then meanwhile, and then they introduce another one. That's kind of what we have in this passage. In verse 25, it says, "Now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years. According to the book of Leviticus, chapter 15, verses 19 to 25, she would have been declared unclean during the entire 12 years. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means anything or anyone that she touched during that period of time would have also been declared unclean. That means that she would have been an outcast from society for 12 long years. One of the interesting things about this passage, as I said, we see lives that intertwine. If you go back 12 years from the day in our text, we'll find Jesus, for example, about 20 years old and working as a carpenter. We don't have any account of Jesus when he was 20, but again, if you go back 12 years from the date of this passage, Jesus, who was about 32 roughly at this point, would have been about 20 years old. So a period of his life that we know nothing about, but we know, again, he was in the carpenter shop. This woman, of course, had the beginning. She didn't realize it was the beginning, but on day one, something like this has to start somewhere. And so this was the beginning of a 12 long year issue of blood. And in the home of Jairus, there was a great joy and celebration 12 years earlier at the birth of a beautiful, bouncing baby girl. So it's sort of interesting to see how these three lives intertwine here or kind of meet like at a crossroads. Jesus and this woman, and Jairus and his family with his daughter. Verse 26 says, "And had suffered many things from many physicians," talking about the woman. "She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grow worse." We're given some interesting details here. Mark says that she had suffered many things from many physicians. It's hard to say what all that involves, but she had gone to multiple doctors, as you would expect. She wants to be healed, and she had spent all that she had. And he adds, not only was she not getting better, but rather she was getting worse. So they weren't helping her in this case. And it's interesting that Luke, in his account, Luke chapter 8, and of course Luke was a physician, he was a doctor, he actually says in chapter 8, verse 43, that she couldn't be healed. And that's kind of an interesting little added detail to the story. As she went around to many doctors, she had spent everything she had. She wasn't getting any better, she was getting worse. And Dr. Luke says she couldn't be healed. And you just wonder if there were any of those doctors that knew that, or if they just took advantage of her. Of course, we don't know, but something interesting to think about. Verse 27, "When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment." It says when she had heard about Jesus. She had heard, no question about it, about the many miracles that Jesus had performed, about the diseases that he had cured. And in some cases, it was involving situations as difficult and desperate as hers. And now, based on what she's heard about Jesus, he's passing by. So what would you do in a situation like that? I mean, if you think, put yourself in her shoes, she makes her way through the crowd and comes up behind Jesus and touches his garment. Now, why does she do that? Well, verse 28 says, for she said, and this is giving us some insight into her heart. She says this within her heart. And she said, if only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well. She actually had said, if you look at all the other gospel accounts, if I just touch the hem of his garment, the hem of his robe, she doesn't want to be noticed, and for very good reason. Remember, she was an outcast. So what she does, she's heard about Jesus, she believes what she's heard, she wants to just touch the hem of his garment, and she believes that she'll be healed. Verse 29, when she does this, and this is such a fascinating verse, immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. Can you even imagine? After 12 long years, in an instant, she was cured. And she knew it. That's what that word immediately means. It means she was instantly cured. And she knew it because, as it says here in verse 29, she felt it in her body. She knew how she felt, and sometimes with pains and aches and things as you get older, especially, you just kind of get used to it and you sort of ignore it, and well, that's just the way it is. There's nothing I can do about it. So the feelings that she had in her body for 12 long years that had just become part of her life, she knew instantly that it was over, it was gone, that this issue of blood had dried up. Verse 30 says, and Jesus immediately, knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? In that same instant that she knew that this miracle had been performed, that she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction, in verse 29, Jesus felt power drained from his body. I'll tell you, that kind of gives you goosebumps on top of goosebumps. If that doesn't get you excited, you might want to check your pulse. I mean, just get this picture in your mind. Here's Jesus. She comes up, doesn't want to be seen, doesn't want to be spotted. She had determined that all I have to do is touch the hem of his garment. I'll be cured. She does that in this large crowd. I mean, the people are just pressing against Jesus. And she does that. The moment she does that, Jesus feels power drained from his body as she instantly feels the healing in hers. Again, just an extraordinary passage. Verse 31, but his disciples said to him, you see the multitude thronging you, and you say, who touched me? The disciples, they thought that this was a pretty strange question from Jesus, since the whole crowd was pressing against him, but she alone had touched him in faith in order to be healed. That's why Jesus felt power drained from his body. Now, when he said, who touched me? Jesus knew. Don't think for a second Jesus has no idea. He knows, but what begins to unfold is so the rest of us will know who it is. It says in verse 32, and he looked around to see her who had done this thing. Jesus was looking for her, it says. Not just who did this. He's actually looking for her. Verse 33, but the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. She realizes that she couldn't escape. She couldn't, as she wanted to do, just get in under cover and leave and not be noticed or caught. And she realizes she can't do that. And so she confesses to Jesus the whole truth, what actually had happened. Verse 34, and he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. This verse has an interesting detail that maybe you've never noticed if you've ever studied this account. Jesus tells her, your faith has made you well, which of course it had. We saw that in verse 29. She had felt it. Jesus felt power drained from his body. So what does he mean here in verse 34 when he tells her to go in peace and be healed of your affliction? She had already been healed of her affliction. Well, as bad as her physical condition was that she was suffering from, far worse, namely, was her spiritual condition. Jesus is sending her on her way, having just healed her of both. But I want you to notice in verse 29, It says that she was healed of the affliction. That's referring to her physical affliction. But here in verse 34, Jesus tells her to go in peace and be healed of your affliction. And that, I believe, is referring to sin. Verse 35 says, while he was still speaking, again, we have another meanwhile moment, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? You know, the news of what had just happened as we see it unfolding with this woman is so wonderful and so powerful that you almost forget about Jairus and his predicament. You know, that's how this whole thing started. Jairus had come up to him and had begged him and asked him to come heal his daughter who was sick. But I guess it's too late at this point, would be the conclusion that most people would arrive at, because she's dead. And they even said there's no reason to bother or trouble the teacher anymore. Verse 38, as soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not be afraid, only believe. Jesus doesn't seem to think it's too late. He says in effect to Jairus, you've just witnessed an extraordinary display of faith. Everything is going to be okay. And you know, when you really think about it, this is no accident, obviously, that Jairus, on the way in the process of going to help his daughter, that he was able to see this unfold with this woman. Jesus says, do not be afraid, only believe. Verse 37, and he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. This is that inner circle of three that Jesus gave special privileges to, like the Mount of Transfiguration in the Garden of Gethsemane. He takes all the disciples in and then takes those three a little bit further. This is that inner circle. They had special privileges, and I believe it's because they were closer to Jesus. You know, James tells us if we draw close to God, he'll draw near to us or close to us. And I think that's what was the case with Peter, James, and John. Verse 38, then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult and those who wept and wailed loudly. That word tumult literally means uproar or disturbance. She had just died, and this is quite a display that's going on. This is the second individual that the scripture records that Jesus raised from the dead, the first being the widow of Nain's son. I did another video I'll put a link to in the description if you'd like to watch that. And the third person that the scripture tells us Jesus raised was Lazarus in John chapter 11. I think he raised more than that, but those are the three that are recorded. So Jairus' daughter here is the second. It says in verse 39, when he came in, he said to them, why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. Why all this commotion, all this disturbance, weeping, sorrow? She's not dead, she's sleeping. And verse 40 is interesting. It says, and they ridiculed him, but when he had put them all out, or outside, he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him and entered where the child was lying. Luke, again in his account in Luke chapter 8, verse 53, says that they laughed him to scorn, knowing that she was dead. When Jesus suggested that she was only sleeping, they laughed him to scorn. Why? Because we know she's dead. And here you are, saying, why are you crying? Because she's dead, that's why. Verse 41 says, then he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha cumi, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, arise. Those words, Talitha cumi, was an expression of the Aramaic that the little girl would have understood. That was the spoken language, and it was her native tongue. And it literally means, in Aramaic, little lamb, wake up. Verse 42, immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age, and they were overcome with great amazement. Again, when we think about how these lives intertwine in this passage, the woman who had the issue of blood for 12 years, this little girl who was 12 years old, and boy, when you go back 12 years, again, as I said, Jesus was about 20 in the carpenter shop. Just amazing on this day, this moment, that these lives cross. Verse 43, but he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given her to eat. You know, friends, our God is an awesome God. We have seen here in this passage two extraordinary displays of the power of God, and only God can heal in this manner, only God. Well, thank you so much for watching this video and watching it to the end. If you would, please like the video, give it a thumbs up. Also share it with someone that would be encouraged and blessed by it. I encourage you to visit the channel because there's quite a few other videos on there that you might find interesting that God could challenge and bless you with. And also subscribe to the channel. All of those things are helpful to the channel and much, much appreciated. So once again, thank you for visiting The Essential Truth. This is Pastor Dave. You have a blessed day.